Blind girl tried to tame killer Mustang. What Mustang does next shocks everyone. They called him Diablo, and not just for the color of his coat. Midnight black from mane to tail and eyes like wildfire. He wasn't just feared, he was legend. The kind of legend that left scars, both on fences and on the people who dared to climb them. Diablo wasn't born mean, that's what the old ranchers whispered when they thought no one was listening. But something had twisted the wild Mustang into a storm of muscle and fury. They said he came out of the high desert like a ghost, driving off entire herds, snapping reins, biting through steel bits. 3 trainers had tried. 1 left with a broken collarbone. 1 quit halfway through the first week, muttering that the horse looked at him like he'd already lost. And the 3rd, a seasoned woman who'd tamed stallions from Montana to Mexico, packed up and left without a word after Diablo shattered the reinforced gate she'd just installed. People talked, said the horse was cursed, said he'd never be ridden, never be bridled, never be anything but a danger to himself and everyone around him. The town vet suggested putting him down, quietly, before someone got killed. The local sheriff didn't argue, and yet no one had quite found the courage to make that final decision. Maybe it was fear, maybe guilt, or maybe there was just something about Diablo, something ancient and wild, that made even the most hardened cowboy pause before pulling the trigger. He didn't neigh, he didn't whinny, he screamed, like thunder trapped in a steel drum, like grief wearing hooves. And when he charged the corral fence, the ground shook and people moved, fast. He'd been kept alone in a reinforced pen at the edge of Redstone Ridge, miles from any other horses. A space meant more for containment than comfort. Thick steel posts, triple-layered wire mesh. No one dared to get within 20 feet without a plan. He didn't eat when watched, didn't rest when the sun was up. He paced, circles so tight they wore a trench in the dirt. His hooves chipped, his breath frothed, and every time someone tried to get close, didn't matter if it was to feed, check his leg, or just stand near him, he exploded. By the 3rd week, the ranch hands gave up. Chad Harper, the ranch owner, had been around horses since he was 9. He'd raised broncs, broken colts, led cattle drives across the Rockies, but he'd never seen anything like Diablo. He stood on the porch one evening, staring out at the dark silhouette pacing beneath the moonlight, and muttered, "I don't think that horse was meant for this world." His wife had passed the previous year, and something in his voice when he said it made the others leave him alone for the rest of the night. Then came the letter. It was scribbled in shaky cursive on lined paper and sealed in an envelope still smelling faintly of hospital sanitizer. It said, "Elsie is coming to stay for the summer. Be gentle with her. She's not the same since the accident. Neither am I." It was from his sister, recently widowed, whose daughter had lost her sight in a wreck that took her mother's life. Chad hadn't seen Elsie in years. Last time she was 6 and chasing barn cats through the hayloft. Now she was 12, blind, and arriving with more pain in her small frame than most grown men carried in their bones. Nobody connected Diablo and Elsie at first. Why would they? One was a horse beyond saving, and the other was a girl too broken to fight back. But fate doesn't ask permission. And when the pickup rolled down the dusty drive 2 days later, kicking up swirls of Nevada dust that glittered like gold in the sun, the ranch didn't just receive a visitor. It held its breath. Elsie stepped out slow. No drama, no tears. Her cane tapped once, then again, like a heartbeat against the gravel. She didn't ask where her room was or what time dinner would be. She turned her head slightly, just slightly, toward the distant clang of a hoof against metal. "What's that sound?" she asked. No fear, no hesitation, just curiosity. That sound, that violent sound, was Diablo. And for the first time since he arrived, he went quiet. The house smelled like cedar and memory. Elsie ran her fingers along the walls as she walked, feeling the worn texture of a place that had lived through storms and summers, grief and growth. Her mother used to talk about this ranch like it was sacred ground. Back then, when they'd visit, Elsie would race around barefoot and wild, pretending she could catch the wind. That was before everything changed. Before the accident took more than just her mother. It took the sun, the sky, the way trees danced in the wind. It took color. It took faces. and it left her in a world that most people assumed was dark. But for Elsie, it wasn't. Not really. Losing her sight hadn't taken away her vision, it just rewired it. Sounds became maps, footsteps were voices, wind carried shapes. The world hadn't gone black, it had gone silent, then loud again, in all the ways that mattered. She could hear the way the porch creaked under weight. She could hear the hesitation in her uncle's voice when he asked if she needed help unpacking. She could hear the worry in her mother's sister as she handed her a bag and said, "Try to rest." But more than that, she could hear the thing no one mentioned, the sound that echoed across the fields every night like something trying not to come undone. A sound like hooves and fury, iron and fear, a sound like loneliness wrapped in leather and muscle. Elsie didn't ask about the horse, not at first. She listened. She lay awake that first night, the windows open to the Nevada sky, and she listened, heard the rattling snort, heard the scrape of hooves pacing the same 10 feet of dirt over and over, heard the rustle of feathers when startled birds took flight, heard how the earth held its breath between each angry step. She memorized every beat like a symphony of unrest. By morning she knew. The sound she'd heard the day before, the one that made the earth tremble, wasn't just a horse. It was something else entirely, something trying to stay alive through sheer defiance. She asked her uncle at breakfast, "The horse that's always moving, what's his name?" Chad looked up halfway through buttering toast and paused for just a second too long. "Diablo," he said finally. "He's not like the others." Elsie didn't need to ask what he meant. She could feel it in the way everyone avoided talking about the corral, in the way the barn hands went quiet when she passed, in the way her aunt kept saying things like, "Maybe we'll go into town today instead." People had written Diablo off, just like some had started to do with her. Later that afternoon, Elsie wandered to the edge of the field. She didn't mean to get close. She just wanted to feel the wind the way it danced around the corral. She let her fingers trail over the fence post, rough wood, worn smooth at the edges, like it had been touched by many hands, some hesitant, some brave. She didn't call out. She didn't whistle. She just stood there, quiet, letting the sounds tell their story. And then he moved. The sound of Diablo approaching wasn't just hooves. It was weight. It was presence. It was the earth reacting to something raw and real. Elsie didn't move. She didn't flinch. She tilted her head ever so slightly, the way she always did when she was painting a picture in her mind. 4 hooves, heavy but controlled, breathing sharp but not panicked, a creak of the post to her right. He was close, closer than anyone thought he'd dare get. She whispered, "I hear you." Nothing more, no sudden movements, just those 3 soft words. From behind, her aunt's voice cracked like a whip. "Elsie, step back from the fence." Her uncle's boots pounded across the field. Diablo snorted and backed away sharply, hooves kicking up dust as he retreated, but not in fear, in frustration, in confusion, as if the sudden break in silence had snapped something delicate. Elsie turned to face her uncle. "He wasn't angry," she said. "He was curious." Chad wiped a hand down his weathered face. "Curious gets people killed around that horse," he muttered, but Elsie wasn't listening to him. She was still listening to Diablo, to the way he paced differently now, quieter, less forceful, like something had shifted. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the porch barefoot, knees pulled to her chest, listening to the desert breathe. She wondered what Diablo had seen in her. If he'd sensed the sadness she carried like a second skin, if maybe, just maybe, he recognized it. Because even though they were nothing alike, a wild horse and a blind girl, something about his sound didn't feel strange. It felt familiar, like they were both trying to figure out how to live in a world that kept expecting them to be something they weren't. And deep down, Elsie knew. She didn't come to the ranch to get away from her pain. She came because something was calling her, something that screamed into the wind every night, daring the world to try again. She came for Diablo, even if she didn't know it yet. The next morning broke slow and thick with heat, the kind that made the sky feel heavy and the air buzz with something unspoken. Elsie could hear it in the stillness, The way the cicadas hesitated before starting their morning symphony. The way the wind dragged its feet across the yard instead of racing like it usually did. It was the kind of morning that made people cautious without knowing why, the kind that told you something important was going to happen. And it did. She stepped into her boots before breakfast, tied her cane to her wrist, and walked straight past the kitchen where her aunt was slicing peaches and her uncle was mumbling about irrigation lines. She didn't say where she was going. She didn't have to. Everyone knew where her ears and her heart had been drifting since the day she arrived. The corral, Diablo. That name still felt wrong in her mouth, too heavy, too final. But she used it anyway because that's what the others called him, and maybe the name was part of the armor he wore. As she neared the fence, Elsie felt the weight of 1,000 invisible eyes. The ranch hands paused mid-task. Chad stood frozen by the pump, wrench in hand. Gloria peeked through the curtain with her lips pressed tight. No one said a word, but they watched, waiting, bracing, expecting something to go wrong. Because this wasn't just a girl walking toward a fence. This was a blind child approaching a horse everyone had labeled beyond saving. A horse no one could get near. A horse that had kicked through iron, bucked through sedatives, and come within inches of crushing the vet's ribs last month. And yet here she was, moving closer with nothing but calm in her step and purpose in her spine. Diablo saw her before she even reached the post. He always did. His head lifted from where he'd been circling, nostrils flaring as if trying to smell her intentions. His muscles tensed, not with rage, but with readiness, like a bow strung too tight. He didn't rear, he didn't snort, he just watched. And Elsie felt that watching, sharp and clean like sunlight on metal. She stopped a few feet from the fence, adjusted her stance, and tilted her head ever so slightly. That tiny movement, the one that meant she was listening on a different level, that her mind was building a picture from sound instead of sight, was all Diablo needed to take one step closer. She said nothing at first, just breathed, just existed in the space between caution and courage. Then, with a voice that was more breeze than words, she said, "You walk like thunder when you're mad, but today you sound like rain trying to remember how to fall." For a moment the world forgot how to move. The leaves stilled. The air thickened. Diablo shifted, hooves crunching gravel as he adjusted his weight, and Elsie could hear the hesitation in his step. He wasn't pacing, he wasn't charging, he was circling her, curving his energy around hers like a question. She imagined his body, sleek, powerful, dangerous, but there was no fear inside her, only a strange, electric familiarity. She knew the feeling of people assuming she was fragile, knew the frustration of being stared at, handled, managed, like a cracked thing barely held together. She wondered if Diablo felt the same way every time someone approached with ropes or shouts or expectations. She thought he might. She took another step forward. That's when the world snapped. A sharp gasp from behind her. Gloria's voice choked with fear, and a chorus of rushed footsteps charging across the yard. Someone yelled, "Get back, Elsie!" And someone else shouted, "He's moving!" But she didn't flinch. She didn't turn. Her hand lifted slowly, fingers spread wide, not toward him, but toward the space between them, a gesture of peace, of presence. And Diablo stopped, just stopped, mid-stride, mid-surge, frozen like a statue with steam rising off his back in the early morning heat. "You're listening, aren't you?" she said, not to the people around her, but to him. "I hear you too, even when no one else does." Her uncle's boots skidded to a halt a few feet behind her. "Elsie, come back here right now." But she didn't, because Diablo lowered his head, just an inch, just enough. And it was the kind of gesture that didn't need translation, a lowering of defenses, a whisper instead of a shout. She stepped back slowly, careful not to startle him, and only then did she turn toward her family. "I wasn't in danger," she said calmly. "He doesn't want to hurt people. He wants someone to stop treating him like he already has." There was silence. No one argued, but no one agreed either. They were still stuck in the space between belief and fear. But they'd seen it. They couldn't unsee it now. And as Elsie walked back toward the house, Diablo followed the fence line, every step in sync with hers, as if something ancient had just clicked back into place. And from that day forward, everyone on the ranch would say the same thing when they told the story. That was the day the devil stood still. Every morning, before the sun had fully lifted its head over the ridge, Elsie was already outside, her boots damp with dew and her cane tapping softly along the dirt path that led to the corral. It became a rhythm, a ritual. She didn't ask permission anymore, and no one stopped her. At first, her uncle watched from a distance, arms crossed, jaw clenched, waiting for something, waiting for the Mustang to revert to fury, for the girl to misstep, for the illusion of peace to shatter under one wrong sound. But it never did. Diablo didn't rear, he didn't bolt, he waited, every time, as if somehow he already knew the sound of her steps. Elsie always started the same way. She'd stand just outside the fence, her hands behind her back, her body quiet, and she'd speak to him like he was an old friend, like the two of them were simply picking up a conversation paused by time. No demands, no commands, just stories. She told him about her mother's lullabies, about the way her voice used to rise and fall like warm water. She told him how the night of the accident, the last thing she saw was her mum reaching across the seat, not out of fear, but out of instinct, to protect. She told him how strange it felt to wake up in a world without color, without faces, how people started talking slower and louder, like blindness meant deafness, like she was a problem to solve instead of a person still living inside her skin. Diablo never answered, not in the way people might expect. But his breathing changed, his pacing softened. He began standing still longer each day, his ears twitching toward her voice like it was pulling him closer without force. Some days he would circle once or twice before settling in the corner nearest her. Other days he stood so close to the fence that she could feel the warmth of his breath threading through the slats like silk. She never reached out to touch him, not yet. That was something she knew had to be earned, not taken. The ranch began to change in quiet ways. The hands stopped warning her to be careful. They no longer rolled their eyes or muttered bets about how long it would last. Instead, they worked with a strange kind of reverence, careful not to interrupt whatever invisible bridge was being built between girl and horse. Chad started staying outside longer in the mornings, pretending to fix things that didn't need fixing, just to be close enough to listen. And when Elsie began humming low, steady, tuneless melodies that vibrated in her chest more than her throat, Diablo would lift his head and turn his body slightly, his entire frame tilting toward the sound like it was the only thing in the world that made sense. By the second week, something subtle but unmistakable happened. Diablo stopped pacing at night. The deep grooves he'd carved into the earth around his pen began to fade as new grass pushed up through the loosened soil. He began to sleep, not just collapse into exhaustion, but rest. The night watch said he saw him lying down once, stretched long and still, his breath slow, his muscles relaxed, no twitching, no flinching, just peace. It was the first time anyone had seen him sleep like that since his capture. The news rippled through the ranch like wildfire, not in loud shouts, but in sideways glances and soft remarks like, "Did you hear what he did?" and "She's changing him." But Elsie never thought of it like that. She didn't see herself as someone saving him. She just thought he needed to be heard. The world had spent so long shouting over both of them, telling her what she couldn't do, telling him what he couldn't be, that maybe they'd both forgotten what it felt like to be listened to without fear or pity. And as the days melted into each other like oil on canvas, the space between them grew smaller, not with pressure but with trust. One late afternoon, when the heat curled the horizon and the sky turned the color of spilled copper, Elsie did something different. She walked to the fence as always, but this time she opened the gate. Just a crack, just enough. Diablo didn't move, didn't charge. He blinked once, slow, deliberate. She didn't step inside, only sat cross-legged in the grass with the gate hanging half open, her body as still as stone. She stayed there for nearly an hour, never calling him, never baiting him, just existing. And in the final moments before the sun slipped behind the ridge, Diablo took 3 steps forward and lowered his head, not close enough to touch, but close enough that his breath stirred the strands of her hair. That night, Elsie sat on the porch in silence. She didn't tell anyone what had happened. She didn't need to. The dust on her jeans, the tiny fleck of horsehair on her shoulder, they told enough of the story. Chad brought her a glass of lemonade and sat beside her without a word. They watched the stars come alive together, and though he didn't say it out loud, he knew. Something had shifted, not just in the horse. In Elsie, too. She was becoming whole again, not despite her blindness, but through it. And Diablo, once the symbol of everything wild and unfixable, was no longer a danger. He was a mirror, and mirrors, when held with care, don't break, they reflect. The morning air smelled like iron and dust, the kind of dry sharpness that hinted at something coming, change maybe, or conflict. By then, word had started to travel, not beyond the county line, not yet, but enough that ranchers from down the road were suddenly stopping by with flimsy excuses, curious eyes darting toward the corral. Chad had grown tired of explaining what no one believed. "She just stands there and talks," he said once to an old neighbor who squinted toward Diablo with narrowed eyes. "That's all she does." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure that was the whole truth. There was something else happening, something no one could name without sounding foolish. You could see it in the horse's posture. He didn't flinch at shadows anymore, didn't jerk away from movement. When Elsie arrived each day, he was already waiting. It was on a Tuesday that she said it, sitting at the breakfast table with a calm so steady it made Gloria stop mid-sip of her coffee. "I want to go inside the pen." The sentence hung there like a challenge. Chad set down his fork slowly. "You mean inside the fence?" he said, already knowing the answer. Elsie nodded once. "Yes, with him." Her aunt made a sound, a small gasp buried in the back of her throat, and Chad pushed back from the table like someone bracing for a storm. "Elsie," he said carefully, "he's calm around you now, sure, but that gate's been closed for a reason. You think he trusts you, and maybe he does, but that's still a Mustang, a big, dangerous one. One wrong move." "He won't hurt me," she interrupted, her voice low but steady. "He's not afraid of me, and I'm not afraid of him. That's why it works." Chad stared at her for a long moment, then left the room without another word. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. The next morning, when she reached the corral, the gate was unlocked. But she wasn't alone. Standing near the far post was Carlos Mendez, a professional horse behaviorist from Santa Rosa, called in by Chad the night before. If someone was going to watch this happen, he wanted it to be someone who understood the risks. Carlos was a tall man, wiry, with quiet boots and steady hands. He didn't speak when Elsie arrived, just gave her a small nod, his eyes already locked on Diablo. Elsie didn't mind. She didn't need anyone to believe in her. She just needed them not to get in the way. The gate creaked as she opened it, slow and deliberate, her cane tucked under her arm. She stepped into the pen with the kind of stillness you couldn't teach, the kind that came from knowing the cost of chaos. Diablo lifted his head from the far corner, eyes locked on her the moment she entered. He didn't move, not right away, just watched, waited, the same way she did. They stood like that for nearly a minute, the wind moving around them but not between them. And then, as if pulled by gravity, he took a single step forward, not aggressive, not hesitant, just a choice made without fear. Elsie spoke softly, her words like thread stitching the space between them. "It's different now, isn't it? You're not waiting for the whip, and I'm not hiding from the world. We're just here." Another step, and then another. Diablo's breath was audible now, steady but deep, the kind of breathing that horses only used when they weren't guarding themselves. Elsie stayed rooted in place, hands at her sides, heart pounding so loud she was sure he could hear it. She wasn't blind to danger. She could feel it in the way the earth vibrated with every hoof fall, but she trusted that feeling in her chest more, the one that told her this wasn't a gamble, it was a conversation. Diablo stopped a few feet in front of her. No snort, no tail flick, just stillness. She reached out, slow and fluid, until her fingers hovered inches from his muzzle. She didn't rush the moment. Her hand trembled slightly and she whispered, "Only if you're ready." And then, gently, his nose touched her palm. A hush fell over the entire ranch. Carlos, who had remained stone-faced until then, exhaled sharply and took an unconscious step forward. Diablo's ears flicked toward him instantly, sharp, alert, protective. But he didn't move away from Elsie. In fact, he shifted slightly, putting himself between her and Carlos. It was a small thing, a half step at most, but to those who knew horses it meant everything. It wasn't fear, it wasn't aggression, it was protection. Carlos said nothing for a long time. Then finally, quietly, he's claimed her. Chad, who'd arrived midway through and stood at the edge of the fence, just nodded slowly. Yeah, that's what I was afraid of. But Elsie wasn't afraid. She was standing in the middle of a pen with a Mustang that once couldn't be approached without sedatives, and she felt nothing but a quiet kind of peace settle into her chest. She moved her hand to his neck, let her fingers tangle in the coarse strands of his mane. Diablo lowered his head until it nearly rested against her shoulder. No one moved, no one spoke. The gate swung open behind her as she led him gently back toward the world, not with a rope, not with pressure, just with presence. And from that day on, no one called her foolish. They called her something else. They called her the girl who walked with the devil and didn't get burned. And some even whispered that maybe he was never the devil to begin with, just a soul waiting for someone brave enough to meet him in silence. The sky had begun to pale with the coming dawn when Elsie made her way to the corral again, the morning still cool enough that her breath formed clouds in the air. She moved with the same slow confidence she'd developed over the last weeks. The rhythm of her steps so familiar now that Diablo often responded before she even spoke. By this point, she didn't need to call for him. He came. Each morning, like a tide returning to the shore, he approached as she entered the pen, and though he still watched her with that wary awareness that never fully left his bones, the anger had drained from his movements. The restless pacing was gone. The pounding hooves, the raised hackles, the snorting threats, all of it had been replaced by a powerful stillness that carried the weight of trust. Not perfect, not unshakable, but real. This morning, though, felt different. Elsie could sense it in the way Diablo held his frame, high, stiff through the neck and back, his tail twitching not in irritation but uncertainty. He paced once, twice, in a wide, slow arc around her. Something about the air felt charged. It wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't comfort either, and she didn't push. She stood quietly in the center of the pen and waited, her hands at her sides, her head turned slightly, listening to the sounds of the horse she had come to know better than most people. The scrape of his hooves, the rhythm of his breath, the tiny stutter in his step that told her he was deciding something important. And then he moved toward her. Not a walk, not quite a trot, something between. Purposeful, fluid. He came close, too close, and for a split second even she tensed. He didn't stop a few feet away like usual. He closed the distance entirely, his muzzle brushing against her shoulder as he exhaled, hot and sharp. She could feel the heat of him through her shirt, could smell the wildness that still clung to him like smoke. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She turned her body just enough to face him fully, letting her hand hover near his jaw, her fingers curling slightly but not touching, waiting for him to give her that signal again, the small lowering of his head, the soft nudge, the permission. It came in the form of stillness, not silence, not surrender, but an open door. Slowly she reached forward, her hand brushing the velvet skin of his muzzle, then sliding up along the side of his face. His eyes closed, his breathing slowed, and for the first time Elsie let her forehead rest lightly against his. The connection was wordless, deeper than language. She could feel the tremor in his body, the tension melting in waves. And in that moment they were not girl and horse, not broken child and dangerous animal. They were just two beings who had survived something the world couldn't quite understand. She whispered to him then, voice low, not for anyone else to hear. "You're not a killer," she said. "You're just like me. You got hurt and no one listened. They only looked at what you did, not why." Diablo shifted slightly, his breath catching. She stayed still. "They looked at me the same way," she continued, her voice cracking just enough to show the truth. People say I'm amazing for getting by without sight, but I can tell most of them feel sorry for me. They don't see what I can still feel, what I can hear. They don't understand that I don't want to be fixed. I just want to be treated like I'm whole. Maybe that's what you've been trying to say all along. For a long time they stood like that. The ranch behind her faded into the background. The distant sound of trucks, the hum of conversation, the clinking of tools, all of it disappeared beneath the weight of a moment that didn't need explanation. Her fingers slid through his mane, rough and tangled from years of wind and weather, and she smiled, not a smile of triumph, but of relief. This was the moment she had hoped for, the moment that had once seemed impossible, but it wasn't the end. Later that day, the wind picked up and the sky turned grey, thick clouds dragging across the mountaintops. A storm was coming, one of those sudden Nevada bursts that rolled in without warning and turned everything sideways. As the first drops fell, the other horses were already restless, stamping and snorting in their paddocks. Diablo too began to pace again, not the frantic pacing of before, but something deeper. Memory stirred in his bones, the kind of storm that didn't just bring rain, but flashbacks. Elsie heard the difference instantly in the sharpness of his movements. She ran to the pen before anyone could stop her. The sky cracked open in a scream of thunder and Diablo bolted, not at her, just away, around and around the pen, hooves carving trenches into the wet ground, eyes wild again. The storm inside him had been triggered, and Elsie knew this was the real test, not the bonding, not the petting, not the quiet mornings. This, right here, this was where the truth lived. She didn't wait. She opened the gate and stepped into the pen without hesitation, rain soaking her shirt in seconds, her hair plastered to her forehead. Someone yelled her name behind her, but she didn't turn. She didn't flinch. Diablo skidded around a corner, stopped hard when he saw her there. Steam rose off his back, his ears pinned, his legs twitched. Elsie took a breath and stepped forward. He jerked backward but didn't rear. His chest heaved, his body ready to flee, but his eyes never left hers, or rather, never left her presence. She moved slowly, calmly, one step at a time, until they stood close again. Not touching, not yet. "You're safe," she said over the wind. "I'm still here." Her voice broke. "I'm still here, even when it gets loud again." It took a minute, maybe more, but then Diablo did the impossible. He lowered his head, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough, just a few inches, enough for her to know that even in the chaos, even when every instinct told him to run, he still remembered her voice. And for Elsie, that was enough to know he wasn't just learning to trust, he was choosing it. The storm passed overnight, but it left something behind. Not just broken tree limbs and mud-slicked fences, but a kind of stillness that wasn't quiet at all. The ranch wore it like a blanket, heavy and uncertain. Elsie knew it the moment she stepped outside, the way the wind hesitated at the edge of the fields, the way the barn doors creaked just a little too slowly. Diablo was different. She felt it before she even reached the corral. His presence, usually so grounded now, felt frayed at the edges like a wire pulled too tight. He didn't pace. He stood still, eyes fixed on the horizon, muscles locked beneath his skin. A deep, buzzing tension lived in the air around him, and even the birds seemed to avoid the fence line that morning. Elsie stood beside him for nearly an hour, saying nothing, touching nothing. She could feel the unrest swirling around him like smoke. She didn't have to ask. She knew that something had opened during the storm, some old door in his memory that had slammed itself shut long ago but had come loose in the thunder and wind. Trauma was like that. It didn't follow rules. It didn't give warnings. It just waited for the right sound, the right scent, the right kind of sky, and then it came screaming back like it had never left. Later that afternoon, the hum of the ranch was interrupted by the roar of engines, loud, careless, fast. 4 dirt bikes, maybe 5, tore down the ridge trail, their tires ripping through brush and gravel, their riders whooping and laughing like they owned the land. They weren't supposed to be there, but that never stopped kids with too much adrenaline and not enough understanding. The noise hit like a hammer. Diablo's ears shot back, his head jerked up, his whole body turned rigid. Elsie, who had been kneeling to refill his water bucket, stood instantly, her heart dropping as she felt the shift in the ground. He was gone in a blink. Not physically, not yet, but mentally, he was back in whatever horror had shaped him. Maybe it had been poachers or helicopters, maybe something darker. No one knew for sure. All they had were guesses and scars. But something about the sound of engines, loud and sharp and mocking, ripped through him like a blade. He bolted before anyone could reach the fence. He didn't go for the gate, he went through the fence. The impact shook the posts from the earth and left shards of wood and twisted wire in his wake. Ranch hands shouted. Gloria screamed. Chad dropped the feed bags and sprinted across the yard, already reaching for his phone. Diablo was gone, galloping full force toward the tree line beyond the property, a black streak vanishing into the dust trail left by the bikes. No one could see Elsie move. She was already gone, running barefoot through the field, cane abandoned, voice breaking through the chaos. Diablo! But he couldn't hear her. Not yet. He was lost inside himself, lost in a memory deeper than fear. The ranch hands scrambled to saddle up, grabbing lariats and radios, but Chad raised a hand. Wait, he said, breath ragged. Give her a minute. Elsie reached the ridge just as Diablo disappeared over the crest, his hooves tearing through the earth like it had insulted him. She stood there, chest heaving, every inch of her aching. The dirt bikes had long vanished into the valley, unaware of what they'd triggered. The air was thick with dust and heat, and still she stood there, unmoving. Then she listened. She let the soundscape return to her. Not the wind, not the panic, just him. She knew how he moved, knew the specific beat of his hooves, the way he exhaled through his nose when he was scared versus when he was angry. She filtered through the noise, closed her eyes and focused, and then she heard him, closer than expected, circling back, not because he wanted to, but because he was trapped between his past and the fence line. She didn't chase. She walked, slowly, purposefully, toward the clearing near the ravine, where he now stood snorting and trembling, sweat streaked down his sides, eyes wide with the ghosts of another life. She stopped several yards away, not because she feared him, but because he needed that space, needed to see that she wasn't coming to control, to force, to fix, just to be. Diablo, she said softly, it's not happening again. It's not them. You're not there. You're here. He didn't move. A muscle twitched in his neck. His ears flicked. She took a step closer. You're not alone, she continued. I know what it's like to hear something and feel it everywhere. Like you're back in the worst part of yourself. But you're not. You're not back there. You're with me, and I'm still here. Another step. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that carried weight, thick and sharp, waiting to collapse. And then, slowly, Diablo turned his head toward her. Not all the way. Not yet, but enough. He didn't run. Instead, he stood his ground, nostrils flaring, hooves planted, body trembling, and she walked until she was near enough to reach out, and did. Her hand brushed against his neck, his breath hitched, and then he leaned in, just slightly, pressing his forehead into her shoulder, like a falling tree choosing where it would land. She held him there as the wind picked up again, arms around his thick neck, her face buried in his mane. No one came, no one interrupted. The ranch stayed quiet, because when they finally returned, both of them covered in sweat and dust, moving slow but side by side, there was no need to explain. Everyone knew what had just happened. He hadn't just let her bring him back. He had chosen not to run. The story couldn't stay a secret forever. Something that rare, that raw, has a way of slipping past fences and whispers until it lands in the hands of people who want to see it with their own eyes. It started small. A rancher's son posted a blurry photo on a forum. Just Elsie, her hand on the muzzle of a Mustang everyone believed to be untrainable. Then came a blog post, then a radio segment on a local station out of Reno. Within a week, the calls started. A journalist from Sacramento, a professor of animal psychology from UC Davis, a non-profit that specialized in equine therapy. Some were curious, others were skeptical, and a few were bold enough to say out loud what others only thought, that it was a trick, a fluke, a story designed to make people feel good for 5 minutes before they forgot and moved on. But the ranch didn't care, neither did Elsie. And Diablo, as always, ignored the noise. He responded to her presence the same way he had from the beginning, with instinct, not performance, with recognition. She didn't ask him to do tricks or walk in circles for an audience. She never put a rope around his neck, never forced him into a stall. She gave him space, and in return, he gave her something rarer than obedience. He gave her choice. Theirs was a connection built without the usual markers. No halters, no bits, no saddle, just trust. And because of that, some people didn't believe it could be real. One afternoon, a dark SUV kicked up dust as it pulled down the long road toward the house. Out stepped a woman in a tailored jacket and boots so clean they didn't belong. She introduced herself as Dr. Laurel Hensley, animal behaviorist, published researcher, and, more importantly, an investigator sent on behalf of the state equine board. Her tone was polite, but her eyes were sharp. "There are rumors," she said to Chad on the porch, "and concerns about safety, about liability, about whether this horse should still be classified as dangerous." Chad didn't answer right away. He just nodded toward the field where Diablo stood, loose and unrestrained, calmly grazing a few yards away from Elsie, who sat cross-legged in the grass, humming under her breath like she always did. "You're welcome to watch," he said, "but you're going to have to do more listening than talking." Dr. Hensley stayed for 3 days. She observed from a distance at first, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. She recorded notes, took video, measured Diablo's stress levels with heart rate sensors and infrared scans. But none of it captured what mattered, because numbers couldn't explain how a girl with no sight could sense the exact moment to step forward, and more importantly, the exact moment not to. No algorithm could explain why a horse labeled dangerous by every system in place would choose to lower his head, soften his body, and lean into her palm like it was the only safe place left in the world. But the moment that changed everything happened on the second morning. Dr. Hensley had brought 2 volunteers, neutral parties, both experienced with horses. One by one, they entered the outer part of the corral under her instruction. They spoke gently, moved slowly, did everything by the book. And Diablo responded the way he had always responded to strangers, with distance and discomfort. His ears went back, his posture tightened. He stepped away, eyes alert, hooves shifting nervously, not aggressive but clearly guarded. The first volunteer left. The second tried to approach more directly, and Diablo pinned his ears flat and stomped hard, a warning clear as thunder. No one was hurt, but the message rang loud. Whatever this horse had with Elsie, it wasn't transferable. So Dr. Hensley called her in. Elsie walked to the gate without needing to be asked twice. She didn't adjust her behavior for the crowd or the notepad or the cameras. She just walked, into the pen, into the space. Diablo saw her and stopped moving entirely. His ears flicked forward. His whole body shifted, not into fight or flight, but into recognition. A low, familiar nicker rumbled from his throat. Elsie didn't hesitate. She walked right up to him and lifted her hand. Diablo leaned in. The entire ranch held its breath. She moved around him slowly, speaking to him in that calm, melodic voice that didn't ask, didn't order, just existed. She touched his shoulder, his flank, ran her fingers along his mane. And when she turned and walked across the pen, Diablo followed. Not because of pressure or training, but because he wanted to. Each step matched hers. Each pause mirrored her stillness. When she stopped, he stopped. When she knelt, he lowered his head beside her, resting it gently on the top of her back. The silence was deafening. Dr. Hensley didn't speak for a full minute. Then, finally, "He's not trained, he's bonded." She turned to Chad, the clipboard forgotten at her side. "This isn't textbook, but it's undeniable." Still, not everyone was convinced. A news crew arrived days later. Cameras and bright microphones and leading questions about safety protocols and whether a blind girl should be anywhere near a horse with this history. The headlines were already half written. Miracle or madness? Blind child tames killer Mustang. Is it safe? The kind of sensationalism that turned truth into spectacle. But the truth didn't need defending, because the moment they tried to film Diablo with someone else, he retreated, ears back, chest tight. But when Elsie arrived, everything changed. He softened, walked forward, pressed his face against her open hands and closed his eyes. That footage went viral, not because of the horse, not even because of the girl, because of the way they moved together. Two creatures who had lost so much, finding balance not through dominance, but through understanding. The world called it a miracle, called it magic. But those who had been watching from the beginning knew better. It was something harder, something slower, something real. It was trust, built step by step, scar by scar. And no camera in the world could fake that. The university didn't expect much. They had seen the footage, read the reports, skimmed the online chatter. Viral stories came and went. Half were accidents, the other half exaggerations. So when the research team from the Equine Behavioral Sciences Institute invited Elsie and Diablo to participate in a controlled study, they assumed it would be a short visit, a novelty, a curiosity to examine, catalogue, and quietly disprove. They had data models, decades of fieldwork, and stacks of case studies on horse behavior under stress. They'd seen it all. They believed in science, in structure, and nothing about a blind girl walking freely among a Mustang with a history of violence fit into any of their boxes. But Elsie didn't care about their boxes. She didn't even flinch at the clinical language or the people who spoke around her instead of to her. She walked into the facility with her chin high, her cane swinging with a rhythm that echoed confidence, and Diablo trailing behind her like a shadow. No halter, no lead, no commands, just her presence. That was all it took. He followed her through the gates of a place built to contain the untamable and walked straight into the research arena like it was just another morning at the ranch. The lead researcher, Dr. Malik, requested a demonstration, something measurable, repeatable, a behavior Diablo could be guided through in a structured space. So Elsie nodded and stepped into the center of the arena while the team watched from behind glass, murmuring notes into headsets and clicking their pens with quiet skepticism. The space was open, unfamiliar, controlled lighting, padded walls, artificial turf underfoot, the kind of sterile environment where most horses tightened up and became ghosts of themselves. But Diablo stayed loose, alert but calm, his body angled toward Elsie as if tethered by something invisible. She turned once in place, slowly, and Diablo moved with her, adjusting his stance, mirroring her orientation like they were extensions of the same being. Then she spoke, not loudly, not in commands, but with soft intention. "Walk!" Diablo took a step, then another and another. They began moving in tandem, slow and purposeful, her hand outstretched just slightly to feel his breath beside her. No rein, no clicker, just presence. She weaved through a simple pattern marked by cones. Diablo matched her movements without faltering, brushing his muzzle against her side now and then, as if checking to make sure she was still there. And when she stopped in front of an obstacle, a short barrier designed to test awareness and adaptability, she paused and whispered, "Wait." He did, not because he had been trained to, but because he chose to, because he trusted that her stillness meant something. She stepped sideways, reached forward with her foot and found the edge of the barrier. Then she turned and walked along it, Diablo following with quiet steps, lifting his hooves with care, placing them where hers had gone. The room behind the glass went silent, not one note scribbled, not one keyboard clicked. They were watching something they couldn't explain, and for once they didn't want to interrupt it with analysis. Then came the test they hadn't planned. From the rafters above the far wall, a hawk that had made its nest unnoticed until that moment broke from its perch with a sudden cry, wings flaring, body swooping low across the arena. The movement was quick, jarring. In any other case with any other horse, it would have triggered instinct, flight, panic, danger. The researchers stiffened. One reached for the emergency override on the gate, but Diablo didn't bolt. He didn't rear. He stepped toward Elsie, his flank brushing hers as he placed himself between her and the sky. No command, no cue, just instinct, but not his, hers. Elsie froze, not from fear but from awe. She could feel the air shift as his body shielded hers. He stood like a wall, chest forward, head high, ears back, Not from aggression, but from vigilance. And only when the hawk had disappeared and the arena stilled again did he soften. He turned his head to nuzzle her shoulder, a soft huff escaping his nostrils like a sigh, like relief. Behind the glass, Dr. Malik lowered his headset. "I've never seen anything like that," someone whispered. "It wasn't protection, it was awareness." "No," Malik said, almost to himself. "It was partnership." Later that day, when they gathered around the table to review their notes, the team sat in silence for a long while. The data didn't know how to quantify what they'd seen. Trust had no numerical value. Empathy didn't show up on graphs. And what did you call a connection built entirely on mutual scars, on recognition of pain, on a decision every single day to be vulnerable with another living thing? They called it a miracle in the report, a once-in-a-lifetime bond. But Elsie didn't see it that way. When asked how she did it, how she tamed a killer horse without ropes, without sight, without fear, she gave the same answer every time. "I didn't tame him," she'd say. "I listened, I waited. I showed him what it felt like to be seen without being judged. And once he knew what that was like, he gave it back to me." By the time they left the institute, Diablo had become more than a case study. He had become proof, living, breathing proof, that some things can't be taught in classrooms. Some things have to be earned, slowly, with patience and presence over time. And for the first time, the world began to understand what those closest to the ranch already knew. This wasn't a story about control, it was a story about choice. The land was waking up again, slower now, more deliberate. Summer was giving way to fall, and the hills that had once baked under the sun were starting to soften with the promise of cooler winds and quieter days. The golden haze over the Nevada landscape had turned richer, deeper, like the world had taken a breath and was finally exhaling after months of holding it in. And in the middle of it all, the ranch stood still, not silent but settled, like a place that had finally remembered its own heartbeat. Elsie moved through the world differently now, not because she could see, her blindness remained, but because the weight she used to carry in her shoulders had begun to lift. Her posture had changed. Her steps were smoother, more fluid, as though her body had found a rhythm beyond sight, beyond fear. The girl who had arrived trembling and guarded, carrying a heart fractured by loss, now walked with something close to certainty. Not just because Diablo followed her, not just because she had proved the world wrong, but because in every quiet moment between them, she had found something she hadn't even known she was missing. A kind of belonging that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be real. There was talk now, real talk, not just whispers, about what came next. People from therapy programs and universities and ranches across the country were reaching out, asking questions, making offers. They wanted to study the bond. They wanted to learn how to replicate it, how to measure it. But Elsie wasn't interested in selling a formula. She wasn't interested in turning what she had with Diablo into something that could be mass-produced. What they had wasn't about replication, it was about presence, about understanding that healing doesn't follow schedules or methods, it follows truth. And that looks different for every soul who walks or gallops through fire and survives. So instead of training others, she chose to invite them. A few months after the university trial, the Harper Ranch quietly reopened part of its land, not for business, not for spectacle, but for people, just people, broken people, people who had been forgotten, labeled, pushed aside, veterans with trauma, children with disabilities, survivors of things they couldn't speak out loud. They came one by one, some skeptical, some silent, all carrying their own kind of storm. And when they arrived, they didn't find therapists in white coats or perfectly staged workshops. They found open sky, the sound of wind across the fence posts, and a girl who didn't try to impress them or fix them or even understand them, just welcomed them. And then they met the horse. He was still a Mustang, still wild in his blood, but not in his spirit. That part had learned to rest. Diablo didn't approach everyone. He chose, like he always had. But when he did, when he stepped forward and lowered his head toward a trembling hand or a tear-streaked face, something shifted in the people who received him. They didn't feel judged. They didn't feel studied. They felt seen, and for some of them, it was the first time in years they'd felt anything at all. One boy, 11 years old, hadn't spoken since the day his parents died. On the third day at the ranch, he reached out and brushed Diablo's shoulder and whispered, "You're big." And that was all it took to remind everyone watching that healing doesn't shout. It whispers. It comes quietly, like hoofbeats in dust. Elsie never claimed to have the answers. She didn't write books or give speeches. She just kept showing up. Day after day, rain or sun, frost or sweat. She moved through the routines with grace, cleaned hooves, patched fences, helped other horses who'd been marked as problems. She did it all with the same patience she had offered Diablo. And every time he watched her from the pasture, his head tilted slightly, that same soft look in his eyes, people said he looked more like a guardian than a horse, and maybe he was. Chad too had changed. The man who once grumbled warnings and held his breath every time Elsie neared the fence now sat quietly on the porch, cup of coffee in hand, watching her lead groups through the fields with calm authority. He never said much about it, but he didn't need to. He showed it in the new barn he built with extra stalls, in the ramp installed for wheelchairs, in the softer tone he used when talking to kids who didn't talk back. He had seen what could happen when you stopped trying to control the broken things and simply made space for them to grow. In time, Diablo's story reached farther than they could have ever imagined. News outlets, documentaries, animal behavior journals, even schools wanted to include it in curriculums. But for Elsie, none of that compared to the moment a little girl from Arizona, born without sight, walked up to her at the edge of the corral and said, "I hear the world too." That was what mattered. That was what stayed. And so the story continued, not with an ending, but with a beginning wrapped in scar tissue and wildflowers. Diablo, once labeled a killer, now walked beside people who had given up on being understood. Elsie, once shattered by grief and silence, now stood at the center of a new kind of life. One not built on sight or certainty, but on the kind of faith that comes from choosing to stay, choosing to listen, and choosing to love without guarantees. No one forgot where it started. The blind girl, the Mustang no one could touch, a fence, a whisper, a moment, and the impossible thing that happened next. Not a miracle, not magic, just two broken hearts choosing not to run.